All right, folks, we will get started. First of all, welcome and thank you very much for coming to this lecture of opportunity. My name is Terry Rarig and I teach in the National Security Affairs Department. And on behalf of the Korea elective and the Asia Pacific Studies group, who we also have the director of the APSG here, Kate Walsh, we are happy to be able to welcome our speaker here today, Jenny Town. We are on Zoom, so those of you in Zoom land, feel free to send any questions that you may have via chat, and we will get to those as well as questions here after we have our presentation. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Jenny Town, who is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and the director of the Stimson's Korea program and a wonderful website, 38 North, one of the best sources of information on North Korea, on all things Korea that you can follow. So if you have not been tuned in to 38 North, by all means, do that in the future. She is an internationally known expert on everything Korea, including North Korea, U.S.-North Korea relations, the U.S.-South Korean alliance, extended deterrence, and Northeast Asia regional security more broadly. She is also an associate fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University and a member of the National Committee on North Korea. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and a regular commentator on all sorts of different media outlets, including the BBC, CNN, Financial Times, Deutsche Welle, and Voice of America, among many, many others. One of my favorite accolades that I like to point out about Jenny's background is she was named to the list of Worth Magazine's Groundbreakers 2020, 50 Women Changing the World, for her role in co-founding and managing 38 North. And just in case you were wondering who else was on that list, others included Melinda Gates and Christine Lagarde, who is the current president of the European Central Bank. Some pretty impressive company. And so we are delighted to have Jenny here to be able to speak to us on North Korea's strategic choices and shifting geopolitics. Jenny, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Terry. It's really an honor to be here, a pleasure to be here in person. I have only been to Newport once before, and I've seen the Naval War College from a distance, so it's great to be inside also. And thank you all for attending today. It is certainly an interesting time to be talking about the Korean Peninsula, especially since right now, North Korea is currently holding a meeting of its Supreme People's Assembly, its parliament, and is expected to pass a constitutional amendment that several constitutional amendments that eliminate reunification as a goal for the country, as well as to define the country's borders, including its land borders and its marine borders. So North Korea declared earlier this year that it is a sovereign state without kinship attachment to the South, rejecting the prospect of future peaceful reunification and designating the South as its principal enemy. This was a significant departure by Kim Jong Un, rejecting the principles his grandfather founded the country on. And if Kim does codify new borders, and noted these are unnegotiated borders, not boundaries, it will upend the status quo on the Korean Peninsula, as it essentially negates the terms of the Armistice Agreement, the demilitarized zone, the Northern Limit Line, and all the protocols for such inter-Korean boundaries, forcing us to think about interstate border arrangements and potentially a permanent replacement to the Armistice Agreement. It also challenges South Korea's constitutional claims on the whole of the Korean Peninsula as its territory. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to the legality of these expected changes in terms of international law. But at the very least, it really does force us to re-examine the future of the Korean Peninsula, moving us towards a permanent two-state solution rather than a long-standing goal to return to a unified Korean state. And so whether this moves us in the process closer to peace and finally resolving the Korean War or conflict is really unclear, as our responses to these actions are going to shape which road we go down. So these moves come amid North Korea's continued WMD advancements, upgraded diplomatic ties to Russia, including military cooperation and a new mutual defense treaty, reviving cooperation with Iran, outspoken support for Palestine, growing participation in BRICS events, and a number of additional actions that start to illustrate a larger North Korean strategy aligned with the current geopolitical trends. Multipolarism, anti-Westernism, de-dollarization of banks, wider use of cryptocurrencies, and an elevated premium on nuclear weapons as part of global defenses, big power nuclear arms racing, and US-China competition. These are all global trends that create opportunity for North Korea. And Kim Jong Un has demonstrated time and time again his willingness to break from tradition, to seize opportunities as they arise, adapting his policies and approaches decisively to the ever-evolving geopolitical circumstances. So if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that North Korea nuclear issue cannot be solved in isolation of broader geopolitical trends. For the United States and the Republic of Korea especially, pursuing approaches that are laser-focused on North Korean denuclearization by trying to find the right mix of pressure and incentives to encourage Pyongyang down that path is an increasingly myopic view of the situation, and one especially misguided while North Korea poses such outsized influence on the global security environment. So let's examine both Kim's risk tolerance and some of the global trends that create new opportunities for him. And I think it's important to look at both the internal and external affairs and the way that Kim has really defined his legacy inside the country. So Kim's recent moves really only underscore how, since the beginning of his rule, he has proven to be shrewd and decisive based on his ever-shifting assessment of opportunity around him. He's been willing to take calculated risks on both domestic and external affairs, distancing himself from his predecessors and really working to create his own legacy. In his early days, he took brutal and decisive actions to establish his rule and dominance, while many around him underestimated a young man's ability to seize and consolidate power. He also took risks in changing the social contract with the people of North Korea, humbling himself to admit failure when policy goals were unmet, creating a new sense of accountability and responsiveness to the population that his father and grandfather simply didn't have. He was no longer untouchable and infallible like his father and grandfather, but presented himself as a man of the people, caring for their welfare. He took enormous risk in asserting the state over the military, a change in power dynamics in the country that if he wasn't strong, that could have had serious backlash and potentially led to a coup. He took further risks by raising domestic expectations about their economic future, a vision of prosperity, presenting them with a vision of prosperity, not just survival. He promised them early in his tenure that they'd never have to tighten their belts again, and took several moves to loosen central controls on the economy to encourage economic growth and development. But there were limits to how far that could go without better external relations and easing of sanctions to create both trade opportunities and improve the business potential of the country. So in 2018, 2019, we saw Kim Jong Un take enormous political risks in trying to repair those external relations. The high-profile symmetry of the US and South Korea especially worked wonders to rehabilitate Kim Jong Un's global image almost overnight and restore the country's broken ties with its traditional friends, which had really deteriorated in 2017. What is underestimated is that he spent an enormous amount of time and effort really building up domestic expectations that a breakthrough was coming, and that this breakthrough would bring about a real change for the better for the North Korean people. And some of the things that he did that aren't talked about as much as one, really removing negative propaganda about the US and South Korea from the domestic narrative, allowing cultural exhibitions of, for instance, of K-pop and South Korean culture, which had traditionally been banned, letting Moon Jae-in give a speech to a Pyongyang audience during the summit in 2018, of September 2018. Even the image of the two during that summit, climbing Mount Paektu, the sacred Mount Paektu, holding hands and looking and presenting the image that the future of the Korean Peninsula was together. But when this didn't work, Kim pivoted quickly and decisively to course correct. He reasserted traditional values and ideology. He reasserted the state over the economy and society. He cracked down on outside info, especially from South Korea, and locked down the country in a way to reset expectations and really reassert those traditional values. And this all comes in, for instance, in 2019, after the failure of the Hanoi summit to reach an agreement, which would have been that breakthrough. So on the external front, at the end of 2019, Kim Jong Un really noted his disillusionment with both the US and South Korea, that the relationships could fundamentally and sustainably change, and shifted his strategy elsewhere. He embraced what he saw as a rising China, a rising Russia, and a rising Cold War order against declining what he perceived to be declining US influence, and really aligned himself for the first time in about 30 years on the other half of that ideological divide. When Russia invaded Ukraine and became a pariah state among the West, Kim backed Putin without question, consistently over time, and was rewarded with political cover at first in international institutions such as the UN Security Council, and eventually with greater economic and military cooperation as well. So I lay this out to illustrate Kim Jong-un's willingness to take big swings, to take big risks, but also his ability to assess and recalibrate as necessary in order to seize opportunities, maximize his power and position, and change the status quo in terms favorable to North Korea. So right now, if we look at the geopolitical landscape, there are several trends that really are creating new opportunities for Kim Jong-un. And as I mentioned, multipolarization, anti-Westernism or counter-Western coalitions, and or Cold War-like conditions are all ideal for North Korea. In this space, North Korea's political value increases as Pyongyang is quick to demonstrate solidarity in criticizing the West and standing against Western-imposed values and norms. For North Korea in particular, this means more and more countries ignoring or openly flaunting sanctions, and standing against additional sanctions as a rule. So finding ways to work together with this network of states really creates, with this network of states based on mutual benefit, despite longstanding restrictions. And for North Korea, this has brought enormous opportunity. It means that North Korea can now cultivate political and economic relations, military relations with countries without sacrifice, without having to do the hard work of getting sanctions lifted. And so while the rewards may be smaller than what they would be if he improved relations with the United States and with the West, the results are quicker and immediate, and pose a win-win solution for North Korea. For Kim Jong-un, this has also brought new economic opportunities in areas that have for a long time been restricted, and this is in the defense area. And one thing that he can provide to these states, and as there's active wars going on in both Europe and the Middle East, is in arms, missiles, and other military support. So it won't be state-of-the-art, but in a crunch, North Korean supplies can be backfill and present and add volume to capabilities. So meaning all of this means that there's very little incentive right now for North Korea to work with the US, with South Korea, and with other difficult states where any gains are going to be hard fought, and where there's little expectation of success. Other big trends that really create opportunities for North Korea is really the idea of big power competition. with intense US-China competition, intense US-Russia competition, it means that the US interests are no longer universal, and that there's little incentive to build cooperation among the big powers if there isn't the same level of mutual benefit for both parties. And this is true especially for the US-China relationship. For instance, in Beijing, while Beijing certainly recognizes both Moscow and Pyongyang take actions that work against Chinese interests, it does not mean that China is automatically willing to cooperate with the US to challenge these actions. Because at the end of the day, what the US, China, or what the US, South Korea, and Japan are doing in solidifying a security and economic bloc also works against Beijing's interests. So while North Korea is taking actions that create tensions in the region, there's still lots of perceptions from Beijing, especially as to who's really agitating the relations more, whether it's US, South Korea, Japan, trilateral cooperation and military exercises, or whether it's North Korea's continued WMD actions. Another big trend going on right now is the idea of nuclear arms racing. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been a rising premium on nuclear weapons and global defenses. As the first time a nuclear weapon state has attacked a non-nuclear weapon state and threatened to use nuclear weapons. So we haven't seen this elevated status since before the first bombs were ever used. And so moreover, the big powers are embroiled in essentially what is shaping up to be a nuclear arms race, as they're all working to modernize their arsenals, and as China pushes for significant expansion, the US is really grappling with how to keep up with two nuclear peers, or one nuclear peer, one near nuclear peer, while assuring allies of extended deterrence commitments as well, as smaller countries look to avoid the fate of Ukraine, believing strongly now that only nuclear weapons can play that deterrence role. And certainly in that process, calculating if you do have a situation in which Russia and China are embroiled in conflict with the United States, trying to calculate what would North Korea do. And the idea that it's just going to sit back and watch is probably not the right assessment. So I think, when it comes to global attitudes towards nuclear weapons, until there's a movement back towards global disarmament, making the case that the smallest country with nuclear weapons should choose the path of disarmament while the others continue to arm up, is simply not a compelling proposition. So what does this all mean going forward? And so I think, one, it means that many of our old assumptions are no longer valid. Old assumptions about North Korea and North Korean decision-making are no longer valid. We need to move away from this notion that North Korea's strategy doesn't change, and that what Kim Il-sung wanted, all the Kims just follow suit. And so some of those assumptions, for instance, one, that North Korea is isolated. Well, no, it is not isolated. It has partners and historical friends, and will cultivate relations with countries with shared values, shared interests, and common enemies. Another assumption is that North Korea is on the verge of collapse. Well, unlikely. They've muddled through this long and have proven to be the masters of adaptation and survival. It usually won't be pretty, but they do not fold, and the system prevents upheaval. Another assumption is that North Korea wants normalization with the United States. So for about 30 years, North Korea had the goal of normalizing relations with the United States as both a counterbalance to China and a pathway towards prosperity. But that ambition appears to have passed, as Kim does not appear to believe that relations with the US can fundamentally change without significantly different power dynamics, which means that the focus is on building that power first to at some point come back on very different terms. And the final assumption is that North Korea is willing to denuclearize for a price. Well, I think that's unlikely, and especially not anytime soon. And the price is really only half of the equation. At the end of the day, North Korea is a small, insecure country surrounded by economic, political, and military giants, all nuclear armed, either their own or by proxy. And so convincing Kim that he is safer without nukes, despite the extreme values clash with the West and its southern neighbor, while the country is still at war with the United States, it's kind of a hard sell, especially with the US track record on this account. So while North Korea likely sees value in having some kind of relationship with the United States in the future, it is not an urgent need right now, especially while Kim can cultivate relations with countries willing to disregard or openly flaunt sanctions without North Korea having to make any sacrifices in exchange. Those options often have immediate results, which is also another win for Kim Jong Un in reinforcing his leadership to domestic audiences, unlike the embarrassing performance of 2019 of the Hanoi summit. So North Korea's expectations towards the United States, on the other hand, is that any negotiation will be hard fought, will require sacrifice of some kind, and may or may not amount to anything at all. So far, North Korea has little incentive to take that political risk again. Kim Jong Un has little incentive to take that political risk again. And plus, we give him no credible indication that there's a reason for him to do so, especially when US public messaging emphasizes denuclearization, while North Korea has made clear the nuclear program is in a different phase and no longer the basis for negotiation, at least not anytime soon. So in addition to reassessing our assumptions, we need to recognize that the nature of the challenge has really changed and understand that denuclearization, what we mean by denuclearization, has fundamentally changed from the 1990s when we started working on this issue. It transitioned from a non-proliferation challenge, such as what we face with Iran today and potentially South Korea, to a nuclear disarmament challenge. Our approach needs to adapt as well. The nuclear train left the station years ago, and Pyongyang continues to demonstrate how extensive their program and program infrastructure have become. So how do you convince an insecure country to disarm? While our impulse is to bolster deterrence against North Korea's growing capabilities, while it makes sense in theory, it also dismisses the fact that North Korea is the weaker military in every aspect of capabilities, especially when taking US and South Korean combined capabilities into account. So at what point does bolstering deterrence as the stronger military only exacerbate the situation versus balance the equation? More directly, what level of overmatch is needed for the US and its allies to feel secure? And more importantly, can you credibly convince an insecure, weaker country to disarm by reminding it you can annihilate it at any time with your overwhelming capability, while still continuing to enhance that capability as well? I think these are questions that we really need to grapple with in our messaging and our actions to North Korea, and especially in assessing the balance between what we need to do to credibly reassure South Korea while trying to also assure North Korea, something that we have not managed well in recent years. And finally, in thinking about how to recalibrate policy, I think we need to re-examine our goals when it comes to North Korea as well, fundamentally re-examine our goals. In the past, the US, arguably did not have goals beyond denuclearization when it came to North Korea. It was not a country of high value, but one seen as a subset of other issues, largely US-South Korea relations, securing the defense of our ally, and somewhat a part of US-China relations. Well, now North Korea is playing an active role in the war in Ukraine, has historically provided weapons to Iran and Iran-backed militias like Hamas and Hezbollah, and could play a role in the war in the Middle East if it continues to expand. It poses a greater proliferation risk, especially as its civilian economy falters and its defense industries are revived, and plays a spoiler in our own nuclear strategy planning against the growing two-nuclear peer problem of how we might defend against both China and Russia simultaneously, and what role North Korea will play in that process. So at what point does or should North Korea become a higher national security priority versus simply a Korean Peninsula issue for the United States? And at that point, where do we start? This is not going to be just dust off old denuclearization roadmaps and pick a new milestone to choose to shoot for. We really need to reevaluate whether we have goals with North Korea and what those might be. And for starters, as I mentioned at the beginning, North Korea right now is upending the status quo and challenging the world to accept a permanent two-state solution on the Korean Peninsula. And I think the fundamental question here is, do we accept that? And it seems to me that that needs to be the basis of relations going forward. Either how do we make that work? What steps do we need to take in order to have a peaceful transition to a two-state solution, if we do agree, or how to respond if we don't? And what is the alternative, and what are we willing to do to go there? This is a very different way to think about the Korean Peninsula and the North Korean issue. But we do need a new policy, and one that reflects the realities of the time. I would add that, the consequences of staying the course, of continuing the policy that we do have, are increasingly high. North Korea's power for power dynamic means that a policy that tries to pressure North Korea into decisions we want them to make, especially one emphasizing deterrence and confrontation, will simply push them down the development path faster as they have greater conviction in their decisions. And the inability to at least put guardrails on arms racing on the Korean Peninsula fuels ambitions in South Korea for nuclearization. And while this might be more of a coercive tactic from Seoul right now to get further concessions from the United States on extended deterrence and alliance commitments, the ambition is not going away. And I'll tell you, in conversations I've had with younger scholars in South Korea, they do see great value in having, if they're going to take the risk of nuclearization, they see the value in having command and control versus simply redeploying US nuclear weapons on the peninsula. So as long as the North Korean nuclear threat seems to be growing without limits, the more likely South Korea is to push forward with this path. So, and also it's important to consider that North Korea's risk threshold towards the United States and South Korea is higher than ours is to it, meaning that it's taking moves now to change the status quo on the Korean Peninsula to its favor. And we're generally stuck flat-footed and in reaction mode. So at some point, we need to start thinking about how do we change North Korea's opportunity calculus rather than beat the same old deterrence and pressure drums over and over. And I would say this is not a typical DC view. I hope I've stirred up some conversation and food for thought in the process, and I welcome any questions you might have. Thanks.
Jenny, thank you very much. Excellent, and our North Korea IQ quotient is definitely up. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming.